We're incredibly fortunate to have Aaron Roberts here with us from Melbourne and Hobart from Room 11. Before I introduce him, let me just pay all of our respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we're meeting, both respect to their elders past and present. It's with such pleasure that I welcome Aaron Roberts here to speak to us about his work with Room 11. I'm sure all of you, like me, have been absolutely thrilled by the images of the Gasp Pavilion that have been just coming. These images of this incredible red box framing the Derwent, it's the Derwent River, isn't it? The estuary. So I'm really excited to hear about what other kinds of work they've been doing. So Aaron, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the invite. Okay, so just briefly before I go into the work itself, I'd like to introduce this idea of atmosphere and perceptual phenomena, which our recent work has endeavoured to entail and capture. The creation and explanation of perceptual phenomena, atmosphere, the experiential, are subjective terms and concepts for which it is difficult to fully comprehend without visiting the works. So this is that idea that it leads from the understanding that architecture can only fully be understood in the flesh, its effect being on the body and of the being in the body and the sensorial actions while experiencing a building. The notion of atmosphere is re-emerging as an important area of research in the field of architecture after a period where program, data and image have reigned supreme. In an increasingly globalised culture, one constantly connected via the ever-flowing blog updates and newsletters from DZine, Design Boom, ArcDaily, etc. We're exposed to and subconsciously or consciously influenced by a popularised, curated global image of architecture, predominantly a Western and Eurocentric one. With media's focus on the image of architecture and grotesque levels of object-making, disciplinary self-satisfaction and aggressively competing, attention-seeking iconic buildings, atmosphere and experience and the sensorial nature of buildings is often left out of the conversation. It's these very qualities, however, which consciously or subconsciously influence those who occupy the built realm. Every building has a sensorial profile, whether considered or not. And Room 11 are interested in defining this profile to evoke particular experiences, memories, and re-evaluation of place. In reading the recent OSE issue, Building Atmosphere, it can be seen the history and emergence of defining atmosphere and perceptual phenomena within architecture was perhaps brought to the fore by Henrik Wolffen, however steps back to include Aristotle. Henrik Wolffen established that the spatial shape of architecture was not merely a matter of what you see, but is rather experienced in and by the body, as if it were internally realised. This led to the discovery of assumed motions as key elements of architectural form. Wolffen not only perceived the sensory impact existing in architecture, but conversely interpreted it as an expression of corporeal self. He thus considered the major epochs in European history of architecture as manifestations of changing self, of understanding of the body. This shift of focus in the reading of architecture, this inverse of being no longer concerned with the building but the space it created inside and outside, was a type of liberation to the architect, a perspective essentially opened to the infinite and the indeterminate. Thus, through history, we began to see a shift from the design of the object to that of spatial relationships. This sense can be and does have a psychosomatic impact through the body, through our senses. This is why the atmospheric effect of spaces needs to be taken seriously, and the conscious design of this for all manner of human inhabitation, be it our cultural buildings, our workplaces, or our homes. And I'd say, very particularly our workspaces where we spend a lot of our time. Another key figure in the lead up to the contemporary thinking on perceptual phenomena was Gerard Bohm. Bohm believes that to create atmosphere, one must take into consideration the notion of sensitivity. Essentially, to create atmosphere, we are to design for human sensitivity rather than simply the physical body or the geometry of space. Bohm describes atmosphere as the quality of place, the complex multi-sensory fusion of countless factors, immediately synthetically grasped. is a shared intuition linked to the immediate and to memory. Bohm describes why atmosphere, or in his words, mindful physical presence, is so important today. A growing part of our lives takes place in virtual space. Why now the emphasis on the body? Increasingly, social existence is defined by technology and technological networks. We are no longer present as actual people, but as connections. Home pages, internet addresses, and mobile phones are preconditions for us being able to take part in the social game of existence. Much of our professional lives can be carried out simply by being reached virtually or connected to, and does not hinge on place. Is this the future of technological civilization, a social existence without a body? Contrary to the predictions, an increased emphasis on the body has unfolded with an increase in travel for face-to-face meetings and awareness of body, from philosophy through to the mass practice of contemporary sense of mediation. So yoga and Tai Chi and all those sorts of things are sort of build upon this idea of being more aware of the body in space. The notion that material carries culturally specific undertones is something that Bohm talks about also. The idea that, say, in Switzerland, where we're looking at the work of Peter Zumthor here, where granite has an exuding atmosphere of the fatherland, and so I guess an Australian sort of version of that might be, in a really kind of crass way, like weatherboards on a Queenslander, or in a modern sense, the brick and tile that make up our suburbs. Pallasmaa, Juhani Pallasmaa, another great architect who is perhaps better known for his book Eyes of the Skin, which I suggest you all read if you haven't, suggests atmosphere may have to do with our unconscious recognition of primary images and experiences. So the idea that our notion of architecture and our reading of architecture comes about through old primordial images of like the fire and the hearth and so forth. He sort of turns aggressively against this idea of expertise to maintain one's sense of innocence, receptibility, and sensitivity. This idea that that you have to maintain a sense of naivety in order to be receptive to some of the things that I'm talking about. The issue here is the subjective nature of creating atmosphere, and how in today's focus on quality assured, risk-free delivery of architecture, a practice can deliver that which really only comes into full fruition on the completion of construction. Pallasmaa states, Joseph Brodsky has a beautiful line, "For a maker, experience is not gathering expertise, but uncertainties." Building a place for and allowing uncertainties in the practice of architecture is key to the exploration of new typological conditions relating to perceptual phenomena. One of Pallasmaa's early classmates, Paavo Heinemann, one of Finland's best composers, once told him that for him, the final criteria to judge the quality of composition is to sit and lie in the music, as on a couch. In other words, he tests the composition of his body in muscular comfort. This is this notion that architecture can be judged by the way it makes you feel, or the way your body reacts to it once you're in it. Another concern for the architect in the creation of perceptual phenomena is generally it is not a fast process. Again, when it comes to practice, there is little room, both in fee and timing, to slow down enough to properly consider and define particular intent and outcomes relating to these phenomena. Again, Pallasmaa speaks of a work methodology of slowing the process down, working by hand, by drawing, very different to working through spatial ideas quickly on a computer. It is the slowness of hand drawing, the time it takes, that allows one to think about a lot of the things that influence the design. This slowness is important in writing and the architectural work. The ability to be able to dwell on the mess of architectural work, the ultimate skill being to collaborate with one's own work, not so much to collaborate with others. And I'll come to this work in a moment. This is some work by Leverins, but there's a really nice point here that Pallasmaa makes in relation to writing and architecture. After a certain point, the work, whether design or writing, obtains its own self. That is what you need to discover. Then it takes over and begins to suggest itself. Pallasmaa writes his essays in about 8 to 10 rounds between himself and his secretary. Until the 4th or 5th round, he feels as though he's writing. After that, he feels the essay is writing him. To him, it is at that moment in the creative process that is associated with atmosphere, the point in which the work itself has obtained an atmosphere in itself, a unity of character of its own. Thus, in the creative process, atmosphere enters the work at this moment when the work takes over, when the work achieves its own personality, independent of yourself. He believes in the requirement to become the client, to internalize the client. So this idea that whoever you're designing for, you should try and imagine yourself as them, dwelling in the work. His professor, Aulus Blomstedt, used to say, an important area of the talent for an architect is the capacity to imagine human situations. Architects need the ability for empathy and compassion, to be generous. He believes atmosphere arises from the designer's emphatic sensitivity and skill. Material is very important in our work, the work of Room 11. It's through the analysis and personal experiences of some of our team, particular when they've visited the works of Zumthor and Leverance, that material research has perhaps spoken its loudest. So there's a wonderful moment when visiting, say, the churches of Leverance in Stockholm and Malmö, where something happens, you become like 1,000 years old in a sort of very pleasurable way. The sensation evoked by the brickwork, the bricks, they sort of talk, they have this murmuring sound, this idea that bricks have this tactile joint and that the material isn't just a sort of static component. And Zumthor's work also carries this ability to transport one into an altered state. His buildings have a very bodily influence. In particular, in talking about the way that Zumthor works with models, almost naive models with a strong sense of theatrical ambience. Not in a naive way, or a negative way, but in a sort of way that the models themselves are built from the very material that the buildings are then going to be constructed from. Zumthor designs in a realm where buildings are subordinate to the landscape. His work embeds the phenomenological aspects of place into the built. Without comparing our work to this pretty great master, in many ways our own past, the founders of Room 11, have been shaped in a similar way, of living in Tasmania, of growing up in around mountains, rivers and oceans, where the topographical overlays of the landscape are omnipresent. The mountain west of the city is a dominant shadow and permanent fixture when navigating the landscape around Hobart, where the practice emerged. It is this heightened topographical awareness which has had an impact on decisions to amplify and augment particular phenomenon relating to place and to a given site for each project. In terms of our own strategies relating to perceptual phenomena, it's best perhaps to review this through the prism of our built work and recent installations. Before proceeding, however, a general understanding of these particular projects in reference to geometry, that of form being secondary to effect or intent. So basically what I'm saying there is that our work is pushed through simple and strong geometries which allow the practice to explore deeper considerations within a highly constrained budget and brief. Rather than seek complex geometries which require their own set of rigour, focus and funds, Room 11 seek volumetric and material interplay within a consciously straightforward architectural container. This allows the important focus on intent and creation of particular experiential or conceptual concerns to drive the design process. So, moving on to GASP. This is the original competition panel produced by Thomas Bailey and Megan Baines. They were pretty straightforward. They also were pretty robust in the way that we were understanding the site, and had a lot of, I guess a lot of the complexity came out as we went through the process. Initially there was this idea of community engagement with the actual stripy panels of the bridge themselves. So there was this notion that we would get members of the public to bring timber to the to the site, and they would like paint it their own particular color, and then we would install it. And but on reflection of a 3-kilometer long section of bridge, the contractors, the builders, the council were a little bit concerned about the quality of the timber and the longevity of this process and managing that process. So we ended up controlling that ourselves. So GASP is composed of architecture that responds to the scale of the surrounding landform. Blunt forms frame and command the superlative Tasmanian landscape. Colour and architecture have been used as a vehicle for re-evaluation and reappreciation of place. The reforming of the shoreline embraces the expanse of Elwick Bay. The bay becomes integral to the experience, and a unity has been created. GASP is designed by Tasmanian architects, an unusual brief and a forgotten site. The project was won through a limited competition established by the CEO, Pippa Dixon. The concept for the project was created by Megan Baines and Thomas Bailey, who previously collaborated on their own little big house, which I'll discuss later. Working together late at night, when their small children were occasionally asleep, Baines and Bailey put together a scheme which caught the attention of the competition jury. The concept kept things simple. A slither of walkway approximates the edge of an expansive bay, occasional pavilions where the structure lands on ground, adherence to a curve in plan and strictly orthogonal elsewhere. The competition led to construction and subsequent stages, with Bailey working as the project architect to deliver a 10.5 metre by 3 kilometre project on an extremely tight budget. In strategic proximity to Mona, at the edge of the river, Derwent, the project deftly links previously marginalised sites, similar to many sites around the world. A major highway disconnects central Glenorchy, so the spine's running along here. Here we go, the pointer. Yeah, okay, so this is the bay, walking around here, the red pavilion's out the end, and just along this edge is a major highway. So the highway disconnects central Glenorchy from its water frontage. Glenorchy is the suburb where GASP is located. It's a major new public walkway which provides the opportunity and incentive to visit this intertidal zone as it is inundated by the tides. Elevated, elongated and arcing, GASP is literally a line in the landscape. It's built out over the water, touching land delicately at points and inlets that occur naturally. In addition to the novelty of traversing the bay, this alignment also serves a strategic purpose. The arcing form removes pedestrians from the adjacent Brooker Highway, away from the growl of traffic. The landscape can be appreciated for what it is. The elevated walkway offers the opportunity to inspect the texture of the water plane and see and hear the many birds which congregate along the foreshore. So there was this basically the site was one of those sites which almost has that notion of terrain vague, which is the idea that a remnant site has this very full and plump possibility of becoming something else. It's that sort of possibility that caught Pippa's eye, and it's the notion that just across the way there's this suburb where a lot of people aren't getting out and in an active kind of way, and the site was one that was visited by walkers, but there was no infrastructure to link all the different components together. So the project was born around that. The piece of walking infrastructure has encouraged a massive increase in the number of people walking, running, sitting and talking in the area. On a still warm evening, many can be seen strolling the length of the park or sitting enjoying one of the 3 pavilions which punctuate the walkway and invite people to pause and consider the forested mountain ranges as they rise around the bay and define an extended landscape room. The structure of the walkway is simple and restrained. Timber decking and railings are finished in black, with the exception of the inner faces of the balustrade, which are individually highlighted depending on whether one is walking upon or driving past the structure. The effect is like a moire effect. So driving past the project, the bridge shimmers and kind of has this sort of liminal effect, and then as you're in the actual walkway itself, it almost acts as a container and gives you some form of containment in an otherwise really expansive and open plain. The Grove Pavilion, which is this one, is located as the arch briefly touches the land. Carefully sited between mature existing trees, the low and long structure built to the overarching curve provides shelter and a frame to view the texture of the water and the distant river edges. The pavilion offers barbecues plus access to sound and power services to support events held in the park. The vertical language of the balustrades is reinterpreted here with black painted faces to the outer face of the batten facade. A more restrained palette directs one's focus to the adjacent surroundings, which are framed by the extents of the building. So, in many ways, Thomas and Megan were interested in the building itself, creating this frame to capture this topographical landscape beyond, and that this simple gesture would allow you to see the beauty of what was given, the nature of just what was there. Moving eastward, the walkway directs the visitor to Wilkinson's Point. Here, upon a massive industrial relic, a major new public space awaits. In the mid-20th century, a concrete platform was constructed on reclaimed land in order to facilitate the building of the nearby Bowen Bridge. Exposed and windswept, the point is isolated and spectacular. The potency of this landscape gave rise to the architectural response, which can be summarised as a screen and a series of frames. Massive concrete panels channel a cantilevered space with epic glazing. Again, colour has been used to heighten the experience. The surface of the water becomes a pure focus, highlighted by crimson glass. A yellow skylight renders the Tasmanian sky green. The far edge of the courtyard is formed by a further concrete wall containing restroom facilities. Massive wooden gates enclose the court, but can be retractable to enable access during events. Consistent with Dixon's world-class ambitions for the project, GASP has hosted artworks by Turner Prize-winning artist Susan Phillips. So Susan installed a sound work on the footbridge, which was responsive to sight. Basically, as you would approach, it would develop a sort of soundscape around that. Given the location on the point, remote from commercial or residential development, the experience of the architecture is often one of solitude. People walking often pause only briefly and then turn to complete their circuit. The architecture is pure, programmatically there is very little defined, and this was an extraordinary opportunity to create an architecture which speaks to and for this Tasmanian landscape. It's a moving place for anyone who wants to notice the beauty of reality. GASP sits a bit like a mirage. A master plan was developed with a view to directing the future development of adjacent vacant land. When and if these plans precipitate, further construction is unclear. So the site itself sits within this very broad, underdeveloped landscape. So in behind this wall here, as you approach along this edge here, is a large tract of land which is completely undeveloped, is almost like a bit of a muddy paddock in a way. And our site literally captures that edge here, this concrete band, which then connects it to the footbridge. So beyond that, we couldn't actually articulate the landscape. So it's quite a difficult and strange area to design. The project itself has given this river edge back to the public, and I think that's one of the key drivers of what we were trying to achieve. And I might just really briefly talk about how Jeff Malpaz describes the project. There are a few opportunities in Tasmania to work at this scale, and the Glenorchy City Council site also connects with David Walsh's much publicised Mona by Fender Casalidis. The first stage of the project, the walkway, curves around the bay towards the point, reinvigorated a neglected marginal location. It's the second stage of the development on the point itself, where the ribbon of the walkway is finally weighted, that the project really achieves its fullest impact. There, the experience of the surrounding landscape is shaped in a direct and almost commanding fashion by long walls and extend along two cardinal axes. The command here issues less from the walls, however, than from the landscape itself. Hobart is an incredibly windy place, and the point is exposed, so that a key requirement is the protection from the horizontal force that blows across the site. The walls function as shelter, but since they partially obscure the western aspect, they also direct the view. So the way that they shelter and screen, a way that invokes a range of important architectural precedents, even as it establishes its own, the walls make for a complexity in the structure of the space that would not otherwise have appeared. In spite of the widespread rhetoric that suggests otherwise, architects do not make places, rather they respond to them, to the potential in which they consist and which they also offer. So in many ways we're interested in creating a place which had a great deal of open space that could be grabbed by the community and done with what they will. So a space that people can go in and have events in. And I guess that goes back to this idea that architects can create a void rather than trying to fill up a void. And that was a very key driver in relation to this project. So the Little Big House, again, by Thomas and Megan, is one of our simple projects, but within that simplicity there's some complexities which acutely describe some of the key modes of Room 11's practice. So the house is located upon the eastern slopes of Mount Wellington, high above Hobart. It's very mindful of its context, and it's positioned close to the curved linear of the road. Externally, the building is designed to age very gracefully, so the timber here on the facade is a celery top pine, which will just basically go grey. And there was a direct move to clad the entry door here in the same timber, have it recessed so that as the building ages, that door will be a reminder of that age and stay as a sort of a blonde timber. The Dampalon walls, these polycarbonate walls, which are along the face of the building here and along the back of the wall on the next level here, act as these sort of giant light diffusers, and they allow the building to be incredibly light but incredibly private at the same time. So, and the other sort of notion here, which is incredibly important, is that up on the mountain it can get very dark, very wet, and it's nice to be living in something that's very light and dry and feels very kind of volumetric. So the diffusers themselves seem to act as a sort of amplification and subtraction of volume. So when it's very dull, the light seems to compress the space, and when the light's very direct, it seems to enliven and sort of pull the volume up, which is pretty exciting. When the other deliberate things in this project, which I'll sort of come back to. So the entry portal here is very compressed and very tight. So you come into this very small space and then you walk out into this large volume and it sort of lifts you up, straightens you back. The view down to the bay, to the valley and the water is this pane here. And Thomas and Megan particularly very purposely took that away to create a focus on the sky and the more atmospheric conditions up on the mountain, and also to push this view of the established gardens in which the building sits. And then as you walk up through the mezzanine and come out to the top, you're given that larger topographical and landscape-oriented view of the site. So in many ways the project's doing what we do a lot of, and that's pulling particular views away, framing particular views, amplifying certain conditions, which then allow the architecture to reframe and recategorize the place. was this understanding that all the window types would be very particular. So the creation of garden portals, the creation of sky portals, and the creation of shadow walls. So that's basically the notion of the project, was these very simple moves that amplified the natural topographical conditions of the site. Here you can see that portaled out to the garden. In many ways, we have been influenced by, I guess, a Eurocentric view of creation of architecture, and that the response is, I guess, not the typical way of dealing with architecture in Australia, and that of large roof planes and shelter is given on the outside of the building and so forth. This project in particular doesn't have that. It's much more concerned with the notion of the experience of the place within the container of the architecture. So the architecture is reframing that experience and just allowing you to dwell on site. So this idea that architecture can just be an apparatus or a tool through which you can inhabit place. Again, this project operates on some of those conditions. However, this project perhaps tried to evoke some of the more typical Australian conditions of outdoor decks and the veranda and so forth. However, we pushed those spaces back into the volume of the architecture itself. It goes along with this idea that we've had for a while, where we construct a volume and then we carve that away. We sort of reveal other elements in a conceptual notion. And also that outdoor spaces associated with the building should be framed up by the architecture itself and captured as part of that volume. So this project basically laid out a grid on the site, and then particular aspects of the site deformed or ate away or transformed that grid, giving rise to the plan of the building. The outdoor spaces, or spaces sort of outside the inner core of the building, are these coloured zones here, and they go through from being slightly covered through to fully open, through to covered again. There was a couple of key drivers on this project. One was the notion of the heart of the house being the kitchen. So basically the clients were South African. They do a lot of cooking, and the kitchen's always seen as the heart of the house. So the heart connects to these outdoor areas in a very strong way. The other thing that we were interested in with this building was the nature of an entry portal being a signifier and a marker in time. So it's that notion that when you arrive home, you go through this sensorial moment which has a particular smell and a particular kind of materiality which signifies you're coming home, that you can leave the workday behind, and in the same way as you leave the next day, it sort of prepares you to leave that headspace of being at home and enter another one. It's also used as a tool to detract from the sort of penultimate view that you have as you arrive on site. So you arrive at the site, you look out over the valley, the mountains, and the topography, and you can't beat that as a sort of experiential thing on that particular site. However, we use this sort of portal as a way of cleansing that, as a way of pulling oneself out of that notion of the whole site, making one very aware of self in space, and then reframing the topography and the landscape through the parameters of the architecture, essentially amplifying particular characteristics of the site. Here, the outside skin is seen as a very armor-like material, which is a sort of response to the Tasmanian sort of the intense weather and the intensity of the landscape. And then as we've hollowed out and carved out the sort of guts of the building, we've revealed this softer timber layer which encapsulates the existence within the frame of the architecture outside the house, the bits that you inhabit. And as you move further inside, another layer is revealed that it's a little bit more austere because you've got that protective layer of the glass. And the building itself, these sort of outdoor spaces go through different phases and mediate the weather. So if it's incredibly sunny, you can sit under the shaded section of the building here, but yet still see the view. If it's a great day, you can and you don't need that, you can come up here and see the rest of the view, or you can step back further in particular wind conditions. So it's enabling the ability to live outside within the very diverse weather conditions of the Tasmanian landscape. This project is, again, looking at a transformative idea of skin and materiality. So we're interested, this was leading on from some of the work that we did on GASP in terms of the battens and colouring a particular side of the batten. This project was experientially pretty dull from an internal point of view, but had to reflect the client's wishes for it to be a sort of a building which would capture the attention of people driving by and walking around the site. So we were interested in a building which, as you moved around it, it would transform from being a timber building through to a kind of coloured building and back again as you moved around it. And again, the way that we achieved that was to paint the inside faces of timber battens and not the outside face. So as you move around it, the gradient changes and transforms. And from a pedestrian point of view and from a car point of view, it does that thing which the client essentially wanted, which was capture people's attention by the nature of its transformative skin. It's a pretty simple gesture. However, it's incredibly effective in relation to the site and being on the corner of the site. If it was just a sort of one of the buildings next door, it may not have been one of these, it might not have been as effective. But the ability to be able to move around the building in the round allowed us to capture this transformation. It's essentially a skin over an existing building. And you can see that sort of existing building and the apertures and penetrations popping through of a night as they're lit up and the canopy above. This is a little artist residence down in the south of Hobart in Tasmania, and I put this one in, I guess, as a way of again, looking at how we're using very simple devices to sort of reframe place and the landscape. Again, Thomas was the key designer on this project, and essentially it's a little a storage area here and a artist studio that required south-facing windows so that it doesn't get direct sunlight. But the things that are interesting about this are how this element here is changing over time and the screens beyond the building. So you can see it's just in its sort of early stages, the steel's really rusting up and changing over time and becoming redder. And so age in material is quite important to our practice. And then this is the outdoor space of the building. And it has this ability to obscure and abstract the landscape and veil it in a way that allows you to read it in different sort of ways. I guess this turns it into somewhat of a silhouette and lets you read the figure of the landscape in a less detailed fashion. And moving into some more experiential experiments, this project is less about sight and more about perception. We're asked to be involved in a symposium at RMIT. It was based around this idea of inner situations, interior design, and how that might change over time. We're interested in this idea of how materiality might change into the future and how it might have an embedded intelligence and how that intelligence might react to people moving through space and how that might change the experiential qualities of that space. So fundamentally, we were interested in really dumb material having an incredible intelligence. So rubble from this tip having this intelligence in it. So the concept was, in the future, maybe concrete, maybe brick, maybe tiles would all have some sort of embedded intelligence, and that intelligence could react to people's movements and pressure on the actual material itself. So we grabbed a bunch of gravel and we bagged it up and started some experiments with pressure sensors and gravel and ply, and created some algorithms which would change the way that the material appeared to be operating. And then in the design hub, there is some, on the top level, there's some small pavilions. And we took over one of those pavilions, put in a new floor, and covered that floor in gravel. And then set up a series of lights and a series of speakers around the space with a veil, a black veil. And it was this idea of creating an intense interiority and a place that was a no place, basically, and was very much concerned with the notion of body in space and the notion of how we react and our emotional kind of connectivity to that. So essentially, as you would walk around on this gravel field, you would set off particular sensors in the ground plane, and they had a sort of an array of different responses depending on which ones you triggered, in sequence and so forth, which would change the space from a very dark environment to an environment which was sort of glowing in dark reds and blues. And there was a sort of a soundtrack which was associated with that, which would also augment the space. Dust and so forth would kind of rise as people move through it. And it would kind of go through this notion of reacting to people and the amount of people within it. So if the space got incredibly busy and noisy, the space would react in accordance to that. So it would turn to this like red bleed zone, the noise would amplify, and it would almost try and spit you out in an aggressive kind of way based on the aggressiveness of how you were treating the space. So if you stomped around in it, it would stomp back. If you trod lightly, if you moved slowly, it would be very calm and it would play bird noises. But if you moved around like in a violent manner, it would kind of jackhammer you out of there. We worked with Keith Deverill and Marcus Cook to deliver the project. They are video and sound artists. And the other thing that we were interested in was the material itself and how we might really focus in on that. So we deliberately stripped all detail out of the room, and the only thing that had any detail was the rubble. And the rubble itself took on this kind of fantastic quality in that the elements which were reflective would kind of capture the light in different ways to the elements that were non-reflective. And that is, that's our work to date.
Thanks so much, Aaron. I love the idea of this of the space pushing back,
Yeah.
jackhammering the user out of it. We've got a little bit of time for questions. Does anyone have any questions for Aaron? No? I'll start then, shall I? Aaron, it was such a pleasure seeing all of that work. I'm really fascinated by the influence of obviously the Tasmanian landscape on your work, which I think the power of the landscape is almost like providing a foil. It's a thing that you're pushing back on in so much of that work, rather than exposing everything. It's constantly the thing that you're playing with because it's so powerful.
Indeed.
Is there how are you responding to different kinds of landscapes? So if you're working in Victoria, which I know you're based in Melbourne, where do you go?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting actually. So when I first moved from Tasmania to Melbourne, I did an interview on Triple R for the radio show. Are you guys familiar with the? Yeah, you should podcast it if you don't. It's a great show. Anyway, they were asking me this very question. They were saying, given your influences in Tasmania and the fact that you're always designing in these kind of rural or semi-rural environments, how are you going to respond to the Melbourne context, and how would it change the way I practice? And I very naively said that it wouldn't, and that that those signifiers would be omnipresent in my work. And in some ways I was right, and in other ways I was very, very wrong. So the thing that responding to the landscapes in our work has done is that it's given the people that have emerged in our practice a really strong sensitivity to these kinds of phenomenon, and it's made us hyper aware of selves in place, and wherever that is, that sensitivity is there. And it's also given us tools to read landform or read context. And so in responding to the urban realm, it's simply that. It's that we feel we have a heightened sense of sensitivity to that, and that we should respond accordingly. So the parameters change of the environment, but the way that we respond to it, I don't think has. The one thing that I've noticed in our work that has changed is this notion that the architecture that we've done in Tasmania is very much looking outward. Although we have done a lot of courtyard buildings which talk about bringing people back into the building and making them aware of the immediate as opposed to the distant. The work that we've been doing in Victoria, in some instances, is very much the opposite. Sort of turns back onto itself and looks inward, so the courtyard is important in a different way there.
Yeah, it's interesting that the first word that you chose in response to the question to landscape was signifier, and the landscape. It seems to me the landscape in your work is so much more than signifier, right? It's much more about being jackhammered, or a thing that has that kind of power of relationship, which is really interesting in the context of that last project that you were doing with RMIT, because that wasn't in Tasmania, was it?
No, that was in Melbourne, and there's a big sort of theoretical trope around that project, which I didn't go into. Felt the need to not read through that, but the nature is that intensity of landscape is still important to us in this urban context, and we're almost trying to deliver that back through a sort of isolation or a non-space. So the gravel, the harshness of that, the intensity of that, and trying to amplify that component in the work was really, it was a conscious reflection on how we respond to these landscapes. Yeah.
But sort of, I always associate the term signify with the concepts of meaning, and it's so much more powerful than any concept of meaning. You can't deny it. It has an undeniable kind of impact on you, and I guess that goes back to the notion of linking to atmospheres. So the landscape is having this intense bodily impact on you, and we feel that that in creating architecture that's also spatial, that it should have that kind of effect on you as well. So I guess they all end up linking up, and have taken a while to kind of come full circle, I guess. Yeah, very interesting. Any questions? Yes, Sam.
Could you tell us a bit about the way your practice works in particular jobs you mentioned? The others, I don't remember their names.
Sure.
Can you just tell us how you work?
Sure. Typically we will get a project, and we'll open that up to the room, to whoever's free at the time, and sometimes to those who aren't, and come together and talk about the initial ideas. And then from there, the project will be taken away by a lead architect as such. They'll develop it and bring it back to the table at various different stages, almost for critique. And that's generally been the way that we work. We operate in a studio, we work through models, we work through physical models, digital models, we do the sort of required renders and so forth. But the other way that we're, I guess, trying to tease some of these things out is to strip back the building as much as we can. So working through incredibly simple geometries to concentrate on effect or intent, and that's really important to us, particularly given the constraints of budget and so forth. So being able to look through and not concentrate on the complexity of structure and so forth, but rather atmosphere and experience. And the way that the practice works has changed over time in that we originally started in Tasmania and worked together very closely. I moved to Japan for a little while, I set up a studio there, we worked remotely together. Then I moved back to Tasmania, moved to Melbourne, opened a wing there, and again, we're starting to work, began to work that remote channel. And I think it has its benefits and I think it has its downfalls. And but we're sort of gradually trying to work through some of those. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Or
and also, do you have partners?
Yeah, there's 4 directors in the practice. So there's Nathan Crump, James Wilson, Thomas Bailey, and myself. And we work closely with Megan, who is Thomas's partner, on these, obviously on GASP and their own house. They have a very close design relationship, and she has a big influence on a lot of the design. Yeah.
Any more questions? Okay, I can hear your voice going. We're going to let you go.
Thank you.
Can you join me in thanking Aaron for his